Hello and welcome to another episode of Our War to Lovely podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. In this episode, Jessica, Chris and I are joined by regular of the podcast, Mark Connelly. If you cast your mind back, you might recall Mark previously ruined Christmas for us by pooing the idea that the whole of the Western Front broke out in a mass football match. Last year, we discussed your excellent book, Mark, Postcards from the Western Front. And sticking with the theme of tourism, Mark's back to chat about his new venture, Connelly Contours, battlefield tours in France and walking tours in London. Thanks for joining us again, Mark.
Oh, thank you for the invite. It's great to be here again. And as you say, so often the same time of year.
It's not Christmas until Mark Connelly arrives.
Our very own Chris Kringle of something.
Yeah, or the Grinch, yeah, or the dreadful little gnomes, yes. Right.
So you better off start out telling us about Connelly Contours. That's connellycontours.co.uk. Tell us about Connelly Contours.
Yeah. Well, I recently decided, after many great years with so many brilliant colleagues at the University of Kent, that really now was time for a bit of a change. So, and had really been inspired by the fact that whenever I'd taken students on field trips, just to see their reactions to that, and as someone who's always believed in studying history in the places where it happened, to immerse ourselves in landscape is really an important part of understanding the great trends and shifts of history. That here was my moment to really explore that passion and bring it to both hopefully some new audiences and also people who perhaps are very experienced at visiting things like battlefields, but wanted to see things from a different angle, see things through different lenses.
You do walking tours around London, which I was actually doing a walking tour in London a couple of weeks ago, and I did check, but you had none on that day. Otherwise, I'd have been there rather than the slightly thin walking tour that we went on. But I'm intrigued about those London walking tours because you look at an introduction to war memorials and you do First World War war memorials. What I'm intrigued by is what's the clientele for those? Because to me, they're hugely exciting tours and you're surrounded by war memorials and statues in London that you never really notice, which I think is fascinating. But it's like interesting. Who's the clientele? How do you pitch those walks?
Yeah, well, it's literally only just getting going. So, so far, mainly it's been, as you might expect, the great members of local Western Front associations coming along, which is brilliant. And, what a wonderful bunch they are, because, of course, they also bring so much knowledge with them. So it's been great to have conversations as we've gone on our way round. Also, a few people who are interested in architecture and statuary and wanted to get a bit of wider context and also some specific context. And a few people that had done other London walks and just thought this looked a really interesting variant. So it's been a real mix group, and it's been absolutely great to chat and get people's own interests and the way they feel about these things. And also, that thing that I've said to people at the start of them, how much of myself do you want me to bring to this? Do you want me to tell you the ones that I really like, or the ones that I'm less engaged with, or shall I be a completely neutral, or leave it right till the very end and then give you my opinions and what are some of the finest, and some that have been either controversial, or not to everyone's taste. And it's been, everyone, of course, in the end does want a personal opinion. And then we can have a great debate amongst ourselves about what was it about the ones that really spoke to us or the ones that, have been less engaged to us.
So is this focused on the East End, which was the subject of your first book?
No, this is very much central, Jessica. So, starting in both instances, Embankment Gardens, because Embankment Gardens, and particularly Victoria Embankment Gardens, because there you get such an interesting range of things, starting with Victorian statuary, just so you can start to put memorials, into a context where they're coming from 18th and 19th century London street furniture, and ornamentation. And then what is happening to the world by the late 19th century to make it, viable that all of a sudden you're moving from great, often dead people, to commemorating, to commemorating the recently dead, but often from very humble backgrounds, who have died collectively in great causes.
Oh, he's the first one of those. So then that Crimea statue at the bottom of the Haymarket.
Yeah, exactly. I've been pointing that out as a kind of seminal moment, really, in British war memorial development, and what you will see across Western Europe. This moment where we get a memorial that's to a group of statues. That's what you see: ordinary guardsmen on Bell's memorial there. Bell was the sculptor, H. Bell, rather than the commander of the Guards Brigade or anything like that. So, when you've walked there, you've literally just come beyond something like the Duke of York's column, someone who was a really important soldier, or Nelson's column. So it's Nelson, and of course his fleet and his sailors are implicitly commemorated within that space. But then you walk just a few hundred meters, really, and then all of a sudden you're confronted with a group of ordinary soldiers, and that sense in which it's a world, the Crimea, a world and a war which is brought to people thanks to the modern printing press, thanks to newspapers, thanks to the telegraph. A war that encourages, shall we say, a new urban middle class to feel that it has a stake, because it could be presented as a war against czarist autocracy. So we're seeing all of the things, many of the themes that are going to play out during the rest of the 19th century, and certainly during the two great world wars of the 20th century, that are part of our shift to modernity in the way we view war and the way we view the deaths of individual soldiers.
I'm realizing that if I run my current Cultural History of Modern War module again, I'm going to have to make your walking tour my field trip and convince the university to pay for 24 students to come down to London.
Special rates are available for groups. I will say that. Yeah, yes, that actually makes my Christmas already. It does get earlier every year, as we know, Jessica, but hearing that's the first Christmas carol for this season, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, if you can convince the Scrooge that is the University of Leeds Finance Department to pay for the train tickets, then yes, we'll be there with bells on.
When you were starting out with this, Mark, did you already kind of conceive of I'm obviously there's going to be the Western Front aspect, but was the London part like a starting point as well, or did you kind of add it in as you were kind of thinking it through, or was it like when you started kind of thinking about going, no, I do want to do something like this in London?
Yeah, it was really crucial right from the start, because what I would often do with the students, before we had the field trips to France and Belgium as a kind of precursor to that, is to get them into an understanding, of both the differences and the similarities of what they were going to see the other side of the Channel. So the London War Memorial walks, was often the bit that I would do 3-4 weeks before we had the field trip. And so we also, myself and my great old colleague, former colleague and great friend at the University of Kent, Tim Bowman, we would do one for first years in September, particularly for our new military history students, but we'd invite all Airborne to do a war memorials walk round Canterbury and war sites around Canterbury as well. To me, it was always in mind that a London War Memorials walk would be important, and would hopefully, particularly those who did come along on it, who were regular visitors, to the battlefields, would be able to put the experience they go on there into a new perspective by looking at what happens, in Britain, in the capital, not just the capital of the United Kingdom, but also the hub of an empire in the 19th and for most of the 20th centuries. And that would give them something new to think about when they visited the memorials and cemeteries on the Western Front.
Slightly intrigued, people arrive with a bingo list of memorials they think they should be seeing for the First World War, or any of them. I imagine if you could look at all of them, they'll be going, oh, there's Bomber Command, and there'll be sort of that donkey crossing the road for animals. There's sort of a very short list of tick box, but I just wonder if people are taken by surprise, or if they have no tick box at all.
I think what amazes people is just how many there are, and how many that they've walked past, or have a vague sense that it might be a memorial, but they're on their way to somewhere else, and they've not really stopped and looked. So the one that has surprised most people that I take them to is the Royal Naval Division fountain on Horse Guards. Most people say to me, I had no idea this existed. I didn't even know this was here. Yes, a nice little Edwin Lutyens fountain, and there's Edwin doing a really interesting thing, isn't it? That he gives us essentially a country house garden ornament, and he thinks that that's entirely suitable for men killed in the most sort of brutal and modern of wars. So then that's a way of opening up discussions. What should a war memorial do? Should it be entirely naturalistic? Should it be realistic? Is this something that's also a kind of a sense of balm and peace and tranquility to some people? And it's a kind of rightful drawing over of a veil over the horrors of war, to have something as peaceful and restful as a fountain. And the beautiful symbolism, a fountain for men who are part of a Royal Naval Division, that flowing water is a part of their world. So, what does make good symbolism? What does make good iconography? And also, of course, that opens up the whole issue of the audience a war memorial is seeking to address. And of course, the big comparison I then give them right at the end is the Royal Artillery Memorial. Once you get a corps or a unit memorial like that, a memorial that's paid for by gunners for gunners. They're not really trying to talk to the bereaved mums and dads and widows there. This is our war. This is what we did. We are proud of what we did. We are proud of our fallen comrades. And it's speaking in a very different way to say something like the starkness of the cenotaph, which is all about the bereaved projecting their own emotions on to this incredible screen, this almost blank screen that they're given in the middle of Whitehall.
When you were thinking about kind of in these early kind of planning stages of kind of setting this up with and kind of if we kind of look over at the Western Front aspect, I'm pretty sure I've said to you before that the easiest way of traversing the length, the breadth of the Western Front is simply by stepping on the heads of tour groups to avoid getting your shoes muddy.
The Crocodile Dundee approach to it.
Yeah. When you were planning it out, what was it that you were thinking about? Because it's a big field, it's a big business essentially, kind of taking people around the Western Front. What was it that you were kind of conceiving of when you were planning this out?
Yeah, what my very first thought was that I know a lot of guides who are absolutely brilliant, and I don't want to tread on any of their toes. They do great stuff, and their knowledge is incredible, and their approach, and then their sort of the way their personalities comes up. There's no point, and why would I want to? So I suppose what I wanted to do, like really the book Postcards from the Western Front, is try and take people into a space, a landscape which they might be very familiar with, but enter it, shall we say, from an unfamiliar angle. So it was very much to be led with the idea that essentially the fighting is the beginning point for now over a century of remembrance, reconstruction and reshaping. And I don't mean this to be disrespectful to the dead and anyone who suffered in any way, but the memory is now bigger and longer than the event itself. Let's think about what that means, and actually for about us as well. What are we doing for almost it's become a reflective exercise? What brings me back there again and again and again? Why am I so obsessed with this? So it was to then make people think about it's there. Now, my walking trips are particularly to make people think about the way the cemeteries fit into the landscape. What's the motivations behind that? Why do they do that thing, which it is so powerful and perhaps for most people is an implicit reaction, and I'm sort of trying to point out the explicit things, that those cemeteries, particularly those created by what was then the Imperial War Graves Commission, do that perfect thing, don't they? They sit in the landscape rather than on it. They are at one with it. And how did that process come about? What's behind the thinking? What's behind the fine detailing of the construction and the design? And to set that, to try and to get people back into that world, I suppose even more than the fighting. Obviously, I have to sketch out the fight. There'll be none of this. If they were not fighting, this is where the fighting occurred. This is what happened. This is where trenches were. Now, once we've moved beyond that, as these incredibly beautiful places and spaces are being created in the early 1920s, what world do they sit in as well, and to try to point out to people, that this is in a tumult of people returning, of people trying to rebuild their lives, of trying to physically build houses, reclaim farms and such like. And so that world that fascinates me of the immediate aftermath of the war, this incredibly cosmopolitan world that the Western Front was, in which there are a Chinese Labour Corps, there's an Indian and Egyptian Labour Corps, there are Brits, there are Australians, Canadians, there are Belgians and French people coming back, and then there are civilian kind of visitors as well coming in tearful remembrance of lost loved ones. To try and get people into that world is one of my big passions and big motivations for doing this, to think about that immediate aftermath moment, really.
It's interesting hearing you talk about that after our last episode where we were talking about Katrina Pennell and Anne-Marie Inehouse's research into education, and of course those field trips, and they did some focus group research on the government-funded field trips. Again, a similar question to the one about the London walking tours. Who are your audience for these? Are they, again, Western Front Association members who are looking for a slightly different angle? Are they school groups? Who are you attracting?
That's a really interesting one, Jess. I think, yes, I'm certainly interested. I think, and I'm hoping might develop into a big audiences, are things like Western Front Association members who want to think, who have now reached a stage where I won't say, because you never exhaust your original interest at all, but are looking to complement that, or perhaps put it into a wider context, who will be interested in it. I'm also really interested in taking, shall we say, new kind of audiences, but coming from an analogous kind of base. So people that are really interested in 20th century architecture and statuary and sculpture. And so to show them that a lot of the great architecture of the 20th century, like Lutyens, like Charles Holden, that if you're a Londoner and are used to using things like the Piccadilly line or the Northern line, isn't it? I find it constantly amazing. Isn't it amazing that you can go to Arnos Grove and then go to something, or Senate House, if you're someone who's involved in the university life, and then go to something like Messine Ridge Cemetery, and you'll see the direct line, of the way this architect is thinking, that their signatures on the Western Front, which you can then trace in their, shall we say, peacetime civilian work back home, is fascinating. And then to think about their architecture, how did they shape a vision that fits for tube stations, for being something that's sacred and about loss on a vast scale in France and Belgium, and isn't that the genius of things like great architecture and, of course, great horticulture? That these guys that have come from backgrounds, some of them, who have been gardeners in things like country houses, the aptness of taking what is essentially a country house garden and recreating it across the wound, what Wilfred Owen said, the cess of war. So people, I think, shall we say, who might spend a lot of their Saturday afternoons going to country house gardens or going to Kew, and are looking for different ways, or interested in different ways and perspectives on this. That's what I really like to bring into the fold of all of this.
I'm intrigued by, if you have a Western Front Association party, but then you take a school trip, I'm assuming that they're clearly very different groups. One brings a certain knowledge to it, and a school trip might come with a lot less knowledge, only what they've learned in the classroom. They're certainly unlikely to have any emotional baggage because it'll be their great grandparents, possibly even further back. I'm intrigued by how these young people are sort of engaged with the First World War when they're actually in a field in France, as it were. I'm assuming you don't get those who do you think you are moments with people kids breaking down, thinking about great uncle Tommy, who clearly died at this spot because he was there in the Somme, kind of thing.
No, that's right. I mean, and so far, through the new venture, I've not done any school groups, but I was doing it with the kind of old hat on, where I would be asked to help out with some of these things and go along. And I think what's truly amazing. I mean, what it proved to me is, that old cliche that humans are naturally, instinctively historical animals and creatures. We do carry this round in us from the tiniest moment. So, as you say, Angus, perhaps sometimes, depending on precise age and, depending on how much study that they'd done, there was either a greater or a lesser amount of kind of contextual knowledge. But, and a kind of almost instant intrigue, really. Now, of course, it comes and goes. We're talking about younger people here, and the younger they are, if you get a longer day, you don't expect them to be able to keep, the intellectual and emotional intensity up to pitch the whole time. But the click moments are obvious, and it was so clear. I think so many families do that bit of prep with the kids, before they come, so that there were parts of family stories to be told, and it does help, I think, to give them some context to see the ground, and of course, because of the nature of modern social media, and because often knowledge of conflicts across the world are coming at them from so many different angles, I think they were often thinking about these events of over 100 years ago now, with very modern context. So it isn't such a big leap of the imagination, because they've seen destroyed buildings in Ukraine or whatever it is, or they might know someone in their school, who's from a Polish family or something, and there might be some worries back home, what might happen next to us, something like that. So there is all sorts of networks, some of them, really quite sad and tragic about the state of our modern world, which I think help them to make something of the experience of visiting these places.
It's actually interesting. You made me think how Ukraine currently is referred to in First World War-esque language of stalemates, trench warfare.
Absolutely.
Stuck.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, from the moment it got going, it was very interesting, wasn't it? That I'm sorry, we're going off on a little bit of a tangent here. I suppose in the early days, in the very earliest days of this appalling tragedy for everyone that's unfolding there was often perhaps hints at it being blitzkrieg-like, as these great Russian armoured advances occurred. And then, as we know, because they all end up stalling, and it very quickly moved beyond that kind of, shall we say, historical analogy and scenery painting imagery to one which certainly in Britain, you might say that former Britannic world we're very au fait with, which is the idea of trench stasis and deadlock.
There's some quite interesting sort of medical analogies with recycling the wounded and amputees wanting to return to the fighting front, which I picked up on because that was what I was writing about at the time. But just in terms of the point you were making about the Western Front as this cosmopolitan place of return, I just remember quite early on in the war already starting to plan for what happens after the war and rebuilding Ukraine, and particularly the bits of Ukraine that have been occupied after the war. So I think actually that analogy extends much further than just the trenches in all sorts of interesting ways.
Yeah, and again, that kind of brings it back, because as we know, what will eventually happen is a commemorative phase here, isn't it? And as people like Jay Winter have so rightly pointed out, we live in a kind of commemorative world now, one in which almost kind of instantly created remembrance rituals are there, and people expect to see memorials and commemorative forms. And indeed, on the walks, that's one of the questions I've asked of people when we've looked at newer war memorials. What do you think of this phenomenon? Do you think we're proliferating too much? And do we proliferate memorials because we've forgotten that there are plenty out there, as it were, because they have become wallpaper-like and we're walking past them. Perhaps if we stopped and looked at them, would that do anything to temper the urge for new memorials? So the whole thing is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and where the individual falls. I was telling my students, we were talking about visual arts, and I was actually talking about the Royal Artillery Memorial as part of this last week, but pointing out that a lot of Second World War memorials, of course, people are so involved in rebuilding the infrastructure after the Second World War, that it's much easier just to add the names. But that then raises the question of how much are the individuals remembered as individuals in a way that the naming practice of the First World War enables, if you're simply adding them to a memorial that's already been built for other people.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And that opens up the question, doesn't it? That if something, I know, like a really nice post 1945 idea, shall we say, like a health centre, which is partly dedicated to a war date. As we know, a lot of those buildings some of them put up really, really well with great materials, but a lot because of the post-war kind of conditions, perhaps put together relatively quickly. I've got a relatively short shelf life as a building. What happens if you have to, perhaps quite rightly, demolish it to make a new kind of space? Was the way medicine or social care has developed. Does something happen to the memory of that person because they don't have, shall we say, a good old-fashioned freestanding aesthetic memorial, even if it doesn't list all of the names on it? It is something different in the landscape.
It just reminded me of the Second World War. They built the memorial swimming baths where I was growing up, which by the time of the 80s had a problem with the roof kept falling in. So by the 90s it was demolished, and it just becomes Memorial Park, which is just sort of open green space. It's just somehow less impactful for the community than a swanky swimming baths, which had been cutting edge in 1950 when it was built.
Yeah, exactly. And then that brings it circular, doesn't it? Well, perhaps that explains why there is a sort of a resumption of memorial activity, because if suddenly what were obvious links to a community, to its immediate past, fall out of the chain, at some point someone notices, and wants to repair that, or thinks that, or perhaps wrongly assumes that there's never been that link in the chain. And it's convinced that they're sealing a gap that has been yawning for many, many, many years, but perhaps it hasn't actually been the case.
I also wonder whether or not a fair degree of like the kind of commemorative remembrance energy after the Second World War, because as you were saying, there's a lot of effort being spent into rebuilding infrastructure and creating the welfare state, and like gets transferred into things like the welfare state. Whether or not the ongoing kind of British kind of deification of the National Health Service is because it's a war memorial, because that's what we built after the Second World War, where we stuck names on existing things, but the things that we built were the welfare state.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair way of looking and a really great way of looking at it, Chris. And then might explain, as thanks to various social, political, economic developments over the last 30 to 50 years, where we've kind of realigned what the welfare state actually is, what it should do, who actually runs it, who is allowed to, shall we say, to service it, then perhaps that weakens that idea and then creates up a space for new memorials, because people are looking to fill that space, because it's not inherently in them, perhaps in quite the same way that the NHS is a walking, living, breathing war memorial in itself.
Can I take a question about your ambitions for this direction? A London walking tour and the Western Front geographically make absolute sense for a startup company. Is there ambitions to incorporate the memorials of other theatres? Because of course the First World War is a global war. I doubt you can get to the Commonwealth war graves in Baghdad these days.
Exactly. But, yeah. Well, for me, I think if we were to say all of the Christmases come at once, let's do that at this time of year. I think it'd be really interesting to include Italy. Because of that, because of the amazing geographical differences, as we know of Italy, the extreme difference between the far north and the deep south, the geographical kind of climatic conditions, and then what that did. And I'm always being led by what was the IWGC, because that is my single greatest element of expertise in that incredible scenario or scene. I don't know if anybody has been to Casino War Cemetery, Louis de Soissons' work there, where you're in this kind of Renaissance garden, this incredible spot of water and of columns, of things that hint towards, like of pergola spaces. And you have both a dream and a historical reality of sort of Italy there. And then if you go to the Asiago, go to the far north, and suddenly you're in a mountainous area, and to see things, to see a granite world up there, those cemeteries that are designed by Robert Lorimer. And it strikes me, of course, they're going to ask someone like Robert Lorimer, because he's a Scotsman, and they probably think that Scotsmen know about mountains, and that's his kind of natural métier and milieu there. But yeah, I think that because I think somewhere like Italy allows then that sense in which war memorials are designed by these great architects and horticulturists to sit within their landscapes. They are very landscape specific, and so to expand to something like Italy, I think would be wonderful. And also, there are other kinds of sybaritic reasons why that.
I was going to say, Chris and Mark, I don't know if either of you went to the Landscapes of the Great War conference. That was the International Society conference I think it was 2014 actually, and that was in Italy, which was, for sybaritic reasons, but it was the most extraordinary conference. It started in Perugia and ended in Turin, something like that. Two different cities, and then a day in between where we were traveling between the two by coach and stopping at all the war memorials in the mountains. I mean, extraordinary. We went to one of the forts that was built into the mountains that the Italians were holding, or the Austrians were holding, I guess, where you see all those pictures of people hauling a gun up the side of a sheer precipice that to attack these things. And that's, this huge solid granite structure. And then the memorials, which pull on the garden theme, but also echo that sort of massive nature of the architecture that's already there. And it's part of both the mountains and the history of the place. I could see a really, really good tour in Italy.
Well, from a commercial point of view, is anyone already running trips to Italy? It's slightly, I'm just wondering if the oxygen's completely sucked up by either the Australians in Gallipoli, because obviously there was only Australians there, and the Western Front in France.
Yes, I should do a bit more exploring of that, shouldn't I? I'm sure there are some that must do it. Yeah, it'd be it's an interesting one, because as we know, there's still that feeling, isn't there, that the Italian campaign in the Second World War is one of the forgotten fronts. If you think of how much attention we've paid to D-Day this summer, I can't even remember. Was the anniversary of the fall of Rome in the same?
No.
Yeah, I don't really remember seeing much about that. I don't remember seeing much about Anzio or Salerno or anything like that. And yet, vast campaigns swallowing huge numbers of soldiers, and again from across the globe as well. And yet, Normandy, the great northwestern European campaign, is the one that holds on.
Are you picking up at all on this new peace trail on the Western Front?
No, that's interesting. I mean, I'd heard little things about it, but I hadn't really got to tread it or to see much sense of an infrastructure for it. Whether there are signboards or anything like that up yet.
Is that's doing the front line from the coast to Switzerland? Is it?
Yeah, it's the one that Anthony Selden got very involved with on the basis of somebody's letter from 1915, suggesting that it would be a good memorial, and is now come into being as a memorial.
Yeah, and there was this whole idea, wasn't there, during the war, of like some sort of sylvan way, wasn't there? There would be a kind of forested path that would wind its way from Switzerland to the sea, and so not necessarily sort of big swathes of forest, but some kind of wooded enclosure that would serpent its way through the landscape. But so far, and this might well be, me staring in entirely the wrong directions, I've not seen much obvious sign of it. But it's a fascinating thing.
Just as a new version of memorial, the fact that we're still developing memorials to this war in this space over a century onward. And
to come back to something that is kind of entirely organic, that is not meant to require much in the way of, shall we say, architectural content, but it's almost solely some kind of a horticultural experiment. And it strikes me, that these are the kind of ideas that in a world that's much more thinking about trees and the planting of trees and environmental spaces, and maybe even it's part. I mean, I'm just utterly thinking out loud here. Is this also part of a wider kind of mentality where more people are having like humanist type funerals in wicker caskets and things like that. The idea of being, shall we say, more natural than the curated nature of a cemetery.
It does occur to me there's probably an environmental history of the. Has anybody written the environmental history of the war?
There are some things, aren't there? I've seen a few edited collections and different essays. Yeah,
Lots of stuff on landscapes, but less on the environment. That's I don't need another project. I don't need another.
So that's another one for your list, Jessica.
No.
No rush. End of the week will be fine.
I wonder if tours are actually helping fix the landscape. Is it still ever changing, or is it now, no, this is what it has to be like? It's kind of frozen in this sort of, I don't know, mid-century sort of space where it came to settle.
I mean, since I've been going, I first started going mid-80s, and the rise of somewhere like Tyne-Cot. Tyne-Cot has always been a must-see place. Big sheer scale. And its physical siting demands it. But we're all aware, aren't we? I think we've all seen over the years the growth of really needed and useful facilities like the car park, like the visitor centre. Absolutely crucial, because you never had a proper sight line of the cemetery or from the cemetery because coaches were dropping people off. I do see it's an evolving one. I think there are the signs that people are taking notice of the idea of not perhaps purely visiting the same, shall we say, nodal points of the cemeteries, of also trying to leave the car behind a little bit more, trying to do a little bit more walking, getting out perhaps to some of the more quiet places. We'll see. I think there's a sort of new interest in, shall we say, old places. So, quite rightly, as we're more reflective now on things like the contribution of troops from the colonies as opposed to troops from the dominions, to go to places like where Indian troops fought, or that were important to India, or the British West Indies Regiment, or African soldiers. So that sense in which people are perhaps going back to a place they might have known well and visited a lot, but specifically looking out for other things, because they're thinking about them in new ways or approaching them in new ways. But I'm sure it will always develop according to new trends. I mean, the amount of guides that have told me, and Chris, you might have come across this, the surge over about the last 10 years in American interest in the First World War, and how many more people there are now visiting Meuse-Argonne, Chateau Thierry, and a lot more American people getting beyond, shall we say, the greatest generation family history research, and are going deeper, going back into the early part of the 20th century, and want to see these kinds of places. So I think there's been a surge of interest there as well. And of course, we've seen what has happened to somewhere like Villa-Bretonneux, thanks to the way Australian interest, shall we say, as we know, Gallipoli is always going to be hugely important to Australians. But more and more Australians on the Western Front, as there, shall we say, there's a kind of sense of the equal balance of places now. That the Australian Imperial Force made an equally big contribution on the Western Front, and it's also that sense that it's gone beyond Pozières. Now it's come to Villa-Bret, and this understanding of a very late war engagement, and making that into an even more special place for Australian visitors.
Is there a particular time of year, or are there particular times of year when there are kind of like surges? Because, obviously, if you go in the summer, then you can be relatively kind of secure on the weather. But the weather is also quite an important part of the experience. Going to Ypres in the sunshine does not necessarily give the feeling that people want when they go to Ypres, when it's absolutely hammering it down with rain.
Yeah, but it's remarkable. I think rain, sometimes, when I've taken people, I think rain is the single biggest debilitator. I think people can cope with dry cold, and they can cope with summer wetness. If it's the drama of a sudden thunderstorm, it's the persistent rain of West Flanders and northeastern France sometimes, and particularly if you're trying to drag someone along some ridge edge, and I think tempers can start to fray, quite rightly. But then's the ideal time to point out, when, at something like in the commission cemeteries, when they realise immediately after the war that having a shelter in every cemetery is just going to bankrupt them. They'll never have enough money for this. But what they've got to do is build shelter, shall we say, at kind of nodal point cemeteries. So if this weather kind of sets in, your pilgrim within about 10 minutes can get there, stand underneath it, and hopefully see out the worst of it. But yes, I think people like a dash of what they regard as trench weather, and it's so similar then, isn't it, to exactly what C. Montague writes about, doesn't he? When he's become a liaison officer for the press at GHQ, and he's taking these people out to the Somme battlefield in the sort of early spring of 1917 after the Great German Retreat, and so many of those want to hear a long distance shell. They want to get a little whiff of something, but they don't really want to be in it for too long. But a long distance shell that's going right over their head somewhere else, fine, and then we'll all disappear back, to Montreuil or Saint-Omer and have a nice dinner. And I think there is a certain sense that's really important for people's imaginations, of actually bedding themselves into the experience to get a bit of wetness. And certainly.
So do you feed them bully beef and plum and apple jam?
Yeah, hard tack.
Exactly. Give a bit of that, and but no rodents. There are no tame rodents to be brought out on a huge scale. Yes, and run round.
I did an edited collection years ago where someone wrote an article on the Imperial War Museum's trench experience and the debates about smell, which was at the same time as York was doing its debates about smell at the Jorvik Centre. It was a big thing in museums at the time.
It was. I remember being taken to both of them to be wowed by this fantastic new experience as a child.
I missed the ultra trench experience at the IWMI because you could smell it from pretty much anywhere in the museum.
But I'm always amazed by the smell thing. The thing that gets me, because I never went to sort of Jorvik at the heart of the smells and bells experience. But my question is, were they entirely oblivious to it? Because it was, just like perhaps a farmer is oblivious or to certain or smells them, but in a much lower register because it's part of their everyday lives. Whereas I walk onto it and walk onto a dairy farm and you can smell cow everywhere, and it's massive. It's overwhelming to me. So what goes on in smelly experiences? I'm often a bit confused by that
because it doesn't come up in men's letters all that much, does it? The wet does, and the cold does, and the lack of food does, but the smell doesn't. I wonder if they did just get acclimatized to it over time.
Yeah, I think they must have done. Yeah, it was just part of the wallpaper of their world. Whereas being hungry or being wet, that's something really miserable.
I'm intrigued by these London War Memorials, Mark, mainly because you pointed out the naval one, which I must have cycled past year in, year out and never really noticed it. And I'm someone who actually pays attention and would stop to look at memorials to see. So I knew it was the Duke of York who was opposite. I'm intrigued, though. These are all big war memorials you're looking at in central London. I wonder if there's something that people missed. Is there small community war memorials in central London? Because I don't think people now think of central London as being a sort of community. It's a thing where people come and go. But there is people who live there, and certainly 100 years ago there were communities of people lived there. Are there small memorials?
You have to go out, I would say, of the central zone a little bit. So if you go to somewhere like Bethnal Green, to Cypress Street,
that's quite a long way out, though, isn't it?
Exactly. But you're going to see a street shrine. You will see a restored street shrine.
Nothing in the centre of town. There's no Soho community that put anything up, or
you will see the odd little bronze plaque if you stare, intently. Obviously, you've got things like a lot of people will walk past things like the artists' rifles, drill hall now, which is now like an arts centre. That's Bloomsbury, Duke Street. Just off the Euston Road, and you've got this thing, which is a really important part of kind of London history and British military history, starting with the Rifle Volunteers, 1860s, is an incredible drill hall. Would you really know it's there? And of course, it's got that lovely Mars and Athena badge on the pediment above the door. So there are these little kind of reminders of, shall we say, the military life of London and the experience of war that's woven through there. But again, we're back to this thing of, I suppose this is any dweller of any great city anywhere, where there is such a multiplicity of wallpaper around you every day, you forget to notice some of the details in it. You just become oblivious to it.
You just made me think, I wonder if central London, which is probably predominantly owned by the Crown Estate and the Duke of Westminster, I wonder if they weren't very happy with putting a small piece of land aside for smaller war memorials for those communities that did live in the centre of town.
Yeah. Well, also, you've got, and again, it's, I think, more part of the modern cycle of war memorials. What was the old Duke of York's barracks, Chelsea, just off Sloane Square there? And if you go round, what is it, Turk's Head Row, is it called? Which is just off Sloane Street, and that rear part of the old barrack building. There's that little plaque to tell you about the American servicemen and the local people that lost their lives when the V2 crashed down. I think a really busy time of the day where people were out doing shopping, doing all their usual daily things, and so there's this little plaque on the wall, which again you might just think of is the street number of it, or the bells getting through the gate. And this is what I really want to do with people, is make shows desperately late for work, because they should progress very, very slowly. And what was that old boy, that wonderful guy who's on the Great War series, and he really delves into his memory. And he says, you've got to start looking rather than seeing. He says, and you hear rather than just listen. All these things about making these things active, not just passive responses to the world around you. Obviously, for him and his comrades, it was about survival. But I think this is about finding the wondrous details that are around us from the past. And then, hopefully, as we all, I think, like to think of as historians, if we think more deeply about the past and our relationship to it, then that can make us better citizens now.
Because the war memorials I'm most aware of are the ones at train stations. And those are the ones that,
right, yes.
Waterloo, Paddington, King's Cross. But, how many millions of people just walk past those without even realizing what they are? I mean, Paddington's my favorite for obvious reasons from my book, but I walk past the King's Cross. That list of names at King's Cross Station is right by the exit. And I have to remind myself, and, like Angus, I'm someone who looks for war memorials, but it does become part of the wallpaper, and particularly for commuters. Auden's dense commuters come.
Yeah, and even when they're huge. Yeah, like a Liverpool Street station, it's absolutely vast, the Great Eastern Railway one. I think people probably notice it at this time of year because suddenly there's a splash of scarlet all over it, just as there are at Paddington. Oh wow, there's that. Yeah, but these amazing things, and I think the more people just put the antenna up and really start to look how fascinating and interesting it is, and not just for war memorials, for any kind of building and any historical remnant, something that tells us more about how people lived in the past and how they thought.
Yeah, I'll just shame myself here. Stood by the cenotaph, not the cenotaph, Cleopatra's Needle. I thought, oh look, bomb damage from the Second World War because his chunk's taken out. And then my sister said, have you read the plaque? No. She said, no, read the plaque. It's First World War bomb damage from a Zeppelin raid.
Yeah. Could Michael York have started that film? Yes. How many years since I've seen Zeppelin? I don't know. Once upon a time, it seems to be on every Sunday afternoon on British television.
There we go. Well, thank you very much, Mark. So we can find you at connellycontours.co.uk.
That's the one. Yes.
Very good.
Indeed. Lovely.
What we talk about next, Chris? No idea, do we?
I have no idea. It'll be the future then, Angus. We'll be living in 2025. We'll be coming to people live from the moon because it's the future then. So, I wouldn't want to speculate on who our first alien guest will be.
All right. Well, Merry Christmas to all our listeners. Thank you very much again, Mark. And I guess we'll be back in the new year.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll see everybody in 2025.
Brilliant.
Merry Christmas.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, it's a lovely war. Oh, we roast with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the money we earn?